Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we speak to forestry leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of forestry. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today I'm joined by Jason Dain. He's the Director of Product of Forest Operations at Remsoft. Jason, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you and Kevin?
Not too bad, not too bad. So I always love to ask, and these days you never know where people are. Where are we reaching you today on a lovely Friday or maybe gray Friday? I don't know, a gray winter.
Yep, it's a sunny Friday afternoon here in Halifax at my home office. So
Oh, nice. Sunny over there. Okay. It's a little bleary and gray over here in Ottawa. So I always love to dig in. And even though you and I are colleagues, because we both work at Remsoft and we kind of know each other and we've traded some stories, which I will unabashedly pull out and put you on the spot and try and embarrass you just so you know in advance. But I always like doing this because you kind of get to know people's history and their journey. So the one question I always love to ask people is, how did you get into forestry? Is there like a family connection, foresters in the family, or is this just, childhood, just one of those kids, like bushwhacking or just hopping on the bike, going into the bush or whatnot? Yeah.
I was always interested in the outdoors, doing fishing and hunting and that sort of stuff with my family. And I found out about something called the Junior Ranger program that they had back in the 90s, or actually, this would have been in the 80s in Ontario, where they took kids from Southern Ontario and they put them to work in Northern Ontario, learning about natural resources. So, painting picnic tables in parks, clearing canoe routes, tree planting, brushing, all that kind of work. We lived in a remote bush camp near Kirkland Lake, spent 8 weeks in that area doing all kinds of fun stuff. And one day we were out tree planting, and our foreman took us out to see a logging operation, and I was immediately hooked. The sound of that or grapple skidder coming up over a hill late in the evening with the lights on and the big column of black smoke going. It was, just like a little kid in a candy store. So,
Wow, wow. And
uh,
so thinking of that, obviously what I'm hearing is that you're not a Haligonian, which for those who don't know, that's I guess what we call someone from Halifax or that area. Sounds like you're from the beautiful province of Ontario. Is that correct? That's where you grew up and
that's
whereabouts?
right. I grew up in the west end of Ottawa, not far from the office there, in by Carlingwood Shopping Center, and spent my childhood kind of getting in trouble along the shores of the Ottawa River, which wasn't far from my house. So, that the connection to nature was there from a long time. If I wasn't playing street hockey, I was knee deep in a swamp somewhere catching frogs. So,
So what is it mind-boggling at times to think your younger days, flash forward today, where the office is, kind of close to where you grew up. I think, is it kind of one of those otherworldly of like, who would have thought?
that's right. Yeah, it's been a long journey to get here, but when I was in Ottawa last week, it was very reminiscent. We took a drive downtown from the office, and it was going through all my old haunts, so it's quite interesting.
Yeah, you and I
So
were joking about the Golden Palace egg rolls. So for those who know Ottawa, right, we say that and we start laughing, and you're probably laughing right now. And so maybe thinking of that, I believe you're a trained, not that I believe, I know you're a trained forester, but you're also a techie guy. So tell me how that came to be, because you also mentioned you played a lot of hockey, and I think you played a pretty high level hockey as well. So this seems a little bit odd. Forestry, tech nerd, bro, hockey player.
yeah,
Walk me through
yeah.
that.
Well, I was always into Lego as a kid, and whenever something broke in the house, I was the one that was taking it apart to figure out how it worked. And I remember that they had this book at the library at school. It was called How Things Work, and it had all these cutaway diagrams of planes and boats and different things. And I had that book checked out like all the time because I was just so curious about how things worked. And I would go around the neighborhood on garbage day picking up old radios and appliances and bringing them back to the house and ripping them apart to see what was inside. And so at one point, I think it was in grade 6 or 7, my mom brought home an old 8088 IBM workstation from her office that had DOS on it. This was in the mid 80s, and green screen monitor, and she gave it to me to start tinkering around with. So I taught myself how to program in BASIC and just thought it was really neat. And so I kind of had this dual track of being into the outdoors, but also being interested in technology. So, and anything really, any technology, cameras, computers, anything really. So it just became a natural progression that, I joined the two together and made a career out of it. So.
Very cool, very cool. So maybe walk me through the journey. How did you end up at Lakehead? Because back then, there were other forestry schools. So what was it that brought you or drew you to Thunder Bay?
To be honest, that it wasn't a one-day drive from the parents. Um, uh, UNB was reachable within a day for a surprise visit from the parents from Ottawa, and nobody's going to venture to Thunder Bay in the wintertime from Ottawa. That's at least a 2-day journey, so I'd have some warning. Um, the other thing was is at that time they had grade 13, and that wasn't recognized in New Brunswick. So it was a 4-year degree in Ontario and a 5-year degree in New Brunswick. So
Okay.
even though New Brunswick was a little bit closer, they didn't recognize that that grade 13. So I would have had to take another year, which cost more, and then the whole parents thing. So it was a
Yeah.
chance to kind of stretch my legs in a different part of the province, and yeah, it turned out pretty well, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. And so for our listeners, when Jason talks about UMB, that's University of New Brunswick. It's what we can do that in a 10-hour or so drive from
That's
Ottawa
right.
to
Yeah.
Fredericton, which is where Remsoft's headquarters are in Fredericton. And for those listeners who may not know Canadian geography or Ontario geography, you could drive 24 hours, like literally 24 hours in a car from Ottawa and still not get out of the province in the northwest side for scale. Of course, you're going through the Great Lakes, but when Jason talks about being far away, like yeah, no, nobody even today volunteers their hand to say, hey, let's drive up to Thunder Bay. It's more of a haul than maybe than anything else. So very cool. So forestry, what I'm curious to know in terms of your studies then versus what you see today, has the practice of forestry changed that much from your lens? And then we'll dig into the tech a little bit, but I'm curious because you are a registered professional forester. You're also a certified project manager. You've been in this forestry space, forest technology space for well over 25 years, and we'll dig into that. But I'm curious to start, like in terms of the practice of forestry, the science of forestry, what you learned in school to what it is today. Some of these schools have closed or they've been absorbed by environmental sciences or environmental studies. So what do you think about that? How do you see that world or how do you think about that?
I think, when I went through forestry school, everything was pretty well focused on industry. It was a training program for foresters for industry. We still did a lot of science and learned a lot of the background in forestry, but there was always that kind of industrial side to it. So we were doing, management plans with coloring pencils on wall maps and learning how to interpret aerial photos and digitize them into GIS with pen plotters, and it was very practical. Even though it was a degree program, it was very, we were learning dendrology and lichens and pathology and all the ologies. I remember third year was particularly hard, so it was very practical, very hands-on. And it was very kind of, you were looking at field guides and you were using paper forms for everything. And think about fast forward to today where you're collecting data on handhelds, you're using LiDAR. Everything's gone from, 5 pieces of equipment to harvest trees to two, where you had the feller buncher or a guy with a chainsaw and a cable skidder, a slasher, delimber, a loader, a truck. Now it's a high-tech harvester and forwarder, and it's ready to go. So the technology has kind of replaced a lot of these kind of analog things that were done, and sort of digitized them, and that kind of goes to the whole digital transformation of the industry. So,
Interesting, interesting. And so someone who has been working in this space for a very, very long time, and for many of our listeners, you probably know Jason in terms of the work he's done around the globe, truthfully. Maybe walk me through, hey, graduated from Lakehead, got my bachelor's degree in forestry. Um, where did you go next? Did you keep trying to go further away from mom and dad or Ottawa, or did you say, "Ah, I got to come full circle"? Walk me through the next phase, I guess, of post school. What did that look like, and where did you end up, and what were you doing then?
kind of in October of my last year, the company started looking for graduates. There was recruiting programs. I had worked out west and experienced the west coast of Vancouver Island for a summer, and that was really cool. I had some opportunities there. I was exploring some opportunities in Eastern Canada as well because when you grow up in Ontario, everything east of Quebec is Newfoundland. So, but after watching This Hour is 22 Minutes and enjoying some of the East Coast music, I kind of got to learn about the Maritimes and kind of thought it would be a really neat place to work. So I ended up going through the interview process with JD Irving, flying down to St. John, meeting all the people there and getting an offer. So the week after my last exam, I packed everything I owned into my Honda Civic and I drove from Thunder Bay to Sussex, New Brunswick. Stopped at home for a clean, an opportunity to do some laundry and eat some home cooked food. But I basically started working full time basically a week after my last exam. So, it was pretty sudden and hit the ground running harvesting operations and trucking in the Sussex district for JD Irving. So, it was
Wow.
quite an interesting evolution to go from a city almost 1 million people to 100,000 people in Thunder Bay to about 25,000 people in Sussex, in a part of the country that I've never lived. So
Yeah, yeah,
it was quite a change and quite an adaptation, but
yeah.
it was all very good. So
Yeah. Was that the norm back in that time where you went to forestry school, then pretty much you're guaranteed a job coming out?
yeah, pretty much everybody well, most of the class that graduated ended up heading to the West Coast. I think there was only two of us, myself and another person that actually went east to work for Irving, and Um, at the time, it was kind of looked upon as odd as going east instead of where the big boom was. But I think that there was a little bit more sustainability in terms of the livelihood on the East Coast than there was on the West Coast. So
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
kind of taking the long-term view of things and um, decided to go east.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you. Like, obviously, the West Coast, the mountains, there's the Oleo, right? And I always joke with the East Coast, you have so much water, you have beautiful land, cost of living's great. If someone could just build a fake mountain, like just one that just sticks up, and
Yep.
then like everyone would flock over because there's just something about mountains that make everything majestic, even though you have everything you need out east. So at JD Irving for a bit, doing that work, then what happened? Where did you end up after that, or what was the next phase, I guess, in terms of your work?
Well, actually, kind of about 20 months into it or so, I decided that I wanted to go back to school and do the computer science thing. So I ended up applying to UNB for computer science. And basically, I did that for about a semester while I was running a feller buncher on the nights and the weekends for one of the contractors that used to work for me to make some money. And then after a semester of computer science, I realized that I probably should have done a master's program or something a little more advanced because this was kind of pretty basic stuff. And I took a job or I got an opportunity to work with Bowater in Liverpool doing growth and yield modeling and strategic planning using Woodstock of all things. So this was a couple year project that they had initiated to basically try and um, see if there was an opportunity to expand the mill or what the kind of the future held for the property that they had in southern Nova Scotia. So I basically commuted from Sussex to Liverpool on Mondays and Fridays and worked there. And after a while, my wife and I both moved to Halifax, and I commuted to Liverpool, and she worked in the city. So I did that for about 2 years, and that was really great. I got to learn all kinds of technology stuff. And then I decided that it was time to step into the big leagues of IT, and kind of, work for a sort of enterprise level company and sort of challenge myself with new technology. So I applied for a job as a project manager with Lynette Geomatics out of Winnipeg. So I started with them in 2001, and they had built planner and contractor and a series of applications for the mill, the LP mill that was being stood up in Manitoba at the time. So I took on a job with them in 2001, and then I worked there basically ever since. But in the meantime, we were acquired by some private equity, acquired by Sengia, and then acquired by Trimble, and then acquired a bunch of other companies to become Trimble Forestry. And then so I was there basically 25 years with the exception of a 4 month stint at a seafood software company. in about 2006 that, where I realized that I needed a change, but I didn't realize how much forestry was a part of my DNA. So um, I quickly went back with an open door to my old job and just like I'd never left. So
So you took a 4 month sabbatical for seafood, is what I'm
that's right.
hearing. Yes.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome.
Yeah.
Interesting. 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 Yeah. So in terms of that journey, I guess when we think about it, walk me through how technology has changed from your lens. Because again, I think you have a very unique perspective where you're a trained forester, technology guru. You've been at this for a really, really long time. What would you maybe say? Are there three monumental shifts in technology over that period while you're at Trimble Forest over those 2 decades that kind of crystallizes your mind in terms of, man, these were seismic shifts in the landscape that moved the entire industry forward, whether from a technology point of view or just the business of forestry. How do you think about that?
I think the first one was probably in the mid 2000s when the large U.S. mills divested their land bases, and you went from a very vertically integrated forestry business like the IPs and the GPs to a bunch of kind of institutional owners of land, and you created a whole bunch of new customers just sort of out of thin air. And at that time, it was how do we take a company that's in financial services and turn them into forest managers? And so embedding all that sort of forestry knowledge and technology into a system that could help people that weren't necessarily forestry experts, but they had to be overnight because they were taking on this land that was being divested by these mills. So, that was a huge shift in the world in terms of how we thought about, well, you have your vertically integrated company that owns the land, they own the mill, they own the trucks, they own everything, to basically a very hands-off approach where you have more competition for fiber, you have more competition for access to land. It made the whole industry a lot more competitive, and it drove that efficiency that maybe you didn't have when it was all internal and all kind of just would cost in air quotes. This now became a more competitive industry to try and source that fiber cheaper and produce the fiber cheaper and more efficiently. So technology was seen as a way of kind of taking a lot of that institutional knowledge that was in people's heads and sort of systematizing it, if that's a real word, and making it sort of a body of knowledge that people could use. Um, I think the second big one was the forest certification. In a lot of respects, the chain of custody, the environmental certification, audits, the impetus to kind of do forestry right and prove it became a real driver for the use of technology and the requirements to kind of do what you said you were going to do and show that you did what you said you were going to do. So that ability to kind of plunk a point on a map and say, okay, you said this was harvested and it was reforested. Take me there, show me that it happened, validate this information in the system. So whilst it didn't necessarily drive up any of the price of the products for the consumer, it did drive that accountability level to the companies to do more due diligence in terms of their information gathering. It created a lot more information to be managed, and it sort of made that requirement to be digital even stronger. Um, I think the third one was kind of the advent of SaaS software. Everything, you would go typically on an implementation, you'd go into these great big server rooms with false floors and giant cooling units and install the software on servers and these big racks. And that was kind of the standard fare. And then with the advent of SaaS, now everything was kind of hands off. And, now everything it really lowered the bar of entry for enterprise technology to get into the hands of smaller businesses because now they didn't need multiple people in an IT department managing servers. They could just basically procure this stuff on the open market. They could spin up servers in a few minutes. And really, the precursor to that was kind of the whole virtual machine era. So I can remember running multiple virtual machines for different test environments and having databases virtualized. And that was really the kind of the stepping stone between sort of real iron into virtual iron, and then into sort of cloud-based iron, if you will. So that sort of shift, that's kind of happened over the whole course of my career, but it's really lowered the bar of entry for customers to kind of get into technology. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And the follow-on question to that, I guess, is, and we could probably chat about this forever. I'm curious to get your views on in the forestry space. There's some stakeholders, companies that are very active and early adopters and open to innovation. And there's some that maybe we still need to drag a little bit. Maybe there's less kicking and screaming and it's just the dragging part now. But when you think about that period and those maybe three seismic um, um, shifts, I guess, in the landscape. How do you think about, or how would you describe why maybe it's been more challenging in our space to get some of these folks to embrace digital transformation? I do believe to some extent folks are being dragged. There's no choice whether they're in or out. They're being dragged into the modern day. But why do you think that is? Is it just foresters being foresters? Is it the complexity of forestry? Is it lack of resources or investment? Like, how do you think about that? And do you still think that's present today, where we're maybe collectively always fighting an uphill battle in terms of the art of the possible technology versus, hey, this is how we've always done it, or if it ain't broken, or I love my spreadsheets or paper. How do you think about that?
I I think it's interesting, the book Crossing the Chasm kind of describes kind of the early adopters, the pack and the laggards. And within forestry, there's certainly the early adopters and the pack and the laggards. But I think even within those groups, there's a natural resistance to technology. And maybe it's the redundancy, maybe it's not a belt and braces approach where if the power's out, I can't do anything, where I can take a paper form and using my Write in the Rain notebook and a pencil, I can make it work. So, I think that there's kind of a natural resistance to that dependence on technology within the industry. And I think a lot of the people that at least got into it, maybe got into it because they didn't want to be in that sort of technology space. So there's kind of a natural aversion. I just want to be in the woods. And, I think that over the years, kind of managing that change about, well, how do I show you the value of the software to let you be in the woods more? And so, yeah, yes, you do need to do something that you don't like to do, but it empowers you to be able to kind of be more sustainable and be in the field more where you want to be. So, if there's going to be pain, which there is always pain with change, it's how do I minimize it and how do I make it work for you so that it delivers value and sort of eases that transition, that sort of that pain of the transition. So, as somebody that was interested in technology, new and exciting ways to do things were always appealing for me. But my wife has taught me a lot of empathy in terms of, she's not a very technical person, so explaining technology to her is sometimes a challenge. So I think, that's been a perspective that's been helpful to me, and in terms of how do you deliver software to people that don't really want to use it. So it has to be intuitive, it has to be not complex, it has to deliver value, and if it can do those things, it has to be easy to install. These are things that they seem simple on the surface, but if you can deliver them, then you can really drive that change.
Yeah, 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 and it's amazing as even myself, someone who's I like to think reasonably tech savvy. I refuse to let my kids, any of the three girls, touch my phone because the moment they do some configuration to the damn thing, and I feel like a technology Luddite because I'm like, I don't even know how to get it back to how it was before, right? So whatever I hear, or maybe. I don't want to say criticize our space and foresters. I always think back to that example where it's like, yeah, it's like to your point, if it's not, easy to use, simple, providing immediate value, then maybe there's some natural inherent friction there. So you're with Remsoft now. You've spent decades implementing forest management systems, all sorts of technologies. You've traveled the world. So before asking questions around the technology landscape as you know it and then how you envision it. I'm curious to know what was the coolest work assignment that to date just sticks in your mind as, oh, it's like I got to do this side thing or the customer was just like my brother from another mother or something of that. What would you describe as the coolest experience to date in your life, in your journey in forestry?
Uh, that's a good one. There's a few that come to mind, but I think Working in the Nordics would probably be top of mind. The Nordics are a place that's a lot like Canada in terms of the topography, the geography. They're resource based. They're very down to earth. Um, and they also kind of the sort of the after work stuff aligns with some of my passions around the Northern Lights and wildlife photography. So, I can remember, coming home from the office in Umeå, Sweden, and in the winter it gets dark at about 3 o'clock, and I was driving back to my hotel and looking up through the windshield of my car and seeing the Northern Lights and thinking, man, I can't wait to get my camera gear and get out after work. So, that's been an exciting place. I had the opportunity to go there quite a few times, and it was always put on a pedestal, especially going through university, and even in my first job, that the Nordics is kind of the pedestal. This is where they're doing the most innovative stuff, and everything kind of emanates from there in terms of technology and practices. So it was always a place that I held in fairly high regard, and really enjoyed working with the people there, and learned lots of Finnish jokes and Swedish jokes, and some good terms like fika, which is kind of like a coffee and snack break that you take around 10 o'clock, and socialize, and sort of that work-life balance thing that they seem to have a little better managed over there than we have. So it's a really interesting place to visit, and I would say live even at some point, maybe
And
in the
so,
middle of
so
it.
given that you held the Scandinavian, the Nordic regions at a high festival, wrong word, pedestal. So what's the jury say? Was it deserving, holding them at that level? What are your thoughts?
That's an interesting one. I think, strictly from an industrial perspective, they're very well organized. They do a lot of interesting things. Um, they have a challenging forest because it's all very even aged and it's not very diverse. But that's the nature of the boreal forest. So you can't really fault them for the fact that there's only 5 species of trees or 8 species of trees there. So it's kind of not their fault. But in terms of the technology that they're using, in terms of some of the stuff around the wildlife biodiversity guidelines. But these are all kind of recent developments. But I think they led the way in terms of a lot of the industrial practices that we see here in North America and around the world. And I think they're kind of, with some of the EUDR and deforestation stuff that they have there, and biodiversity, I think again they're kind of leading the charge. So, I think that title was deserved, and I think that they're doing a good job kind of disseminating that knowledge to the rest of the world, and kind of pushing the envelope of what's possible.
I was really just trying to get you to say something negative so that all the online mass would be like peppering you in your inbox and your text message. Like, Jason, how can you say that? I'm joking, of course, but so maybe
Mm.
along those lines, how do
Well,
you
there's
think
not,
of
yeah, there's nothing quieter than an elevator ride with a bunch of Finns. I can
that's
say
true.
that.
Well, you said jokes, and I was like, wait, Finns joke and they smile? Like, what do you mean? And laugh? What? And I'm just
Yeah, yeah,
joking to my Finnish friends. Take
yeah.
it easy.
True.
So thinking of that, how would you describe the technology landscape as you think about it today, and then we'll shift gears in terms of what are some of the things you're thinking about in your role at Remsoft. But how would you describe today? What's that landscape look like? Are we closer to that envisioned or aspired digital transformation, or are we still further away?
Yeah, I think I would kind of say this, but I think we're that the technology is further ahead than the people are. So, I think we've kind of charged ahead with technology, but we've maybe kind of distanced ourselves a little bit from our users. And I think that, a lot of these things are really people problems, and aren't necessarily software problems, or they're software problems that need to be solved more in concert. So I think we have lots of cool technology and it does great things, but we need to be more, cognizant about how the human interactions are with those software, and how to get people to kind of use them to their best advantage. So I think there's still lots of room to innovate, but I think we need to be mindful as product managers and software developers, that we don't leave the user behind, and we really make sure that they're in, and sort of participating in that process, in terms of, how do we deliver value, and how do we give you a solution that you want to use and is enjoyable to use, and brings value. So I think there's lots of cool stuff that we're doing. There's all kinds of telematics and lidar, and there's all kinds of technology out there, and so I think we're doing really well in that regard. But I think, we still need to bridge that gap between the technology and the people if we want to win.
Yeah. Sometimes I often wonder if forestry just is simply 2 to 5 years behind mainstream.
Yeah.
Foresters
Yeah.
get there at some point, but there's no point trying to bring some bleeding edge thing from Silicon Valley because our foresters just too pragmatic, too simple. And I don't say simple in a negative way as opposed to the work involved. It's got to work. It can't be flaky.
Yeah.
It's got to be rugged, things like that. But how do you think about that? Do you think that's a fair statement that it's not really about
Uh,
innovation? It's just a little lagging behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think technically that sort of 3 to 5 year time frame is realistic. I mean, I think a lot of forestry people see some of technology as, it's a solution without a problem until there is a problem that it can solve. So I think, it's really about finding technology for solution or for problems that they have today and thinking ahead to problems that they're going to have tomorrow. So it's not necessarily problems that they're going to have in a decade or 2 decades. It's, where do we see ourselves driving value in the business in the next 1 to 3 years with the technology that's available today. You always want to have some of that skunkworks type stuff going that's really out there because that's what every good technology company should be doing. But you also have to be grounded in the fact that the industry may not be ready for it, even though it's got a very compelling value proposition. It just the people aren't ready. So you can't get too far or uh, too distant from the user base in terms of what they'll adopt. And knowing the conservative nature of the forest industry, it's really important to kind of keep grounded in what's, there's the art of the possible, but then there's the what can you implement. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and you can't forget about the art of the possible because that's how you stay innovative. But you also have to remember that people have to use this thing and be successful with it in order to make it win. So
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe if I stretch your thinking a little bit into the future in the context of all of this as like a guru in forest technology, having done this for like 25 or so years, what does AI to mean to you? Is it hype or is there something legitimate? How do you think about AI in the context of forestry and forest technology?
yeah, I think it has a place. I think it has a big place, and I think people's context of AI in the biggest sense is what they see in the world, which is sort of language model based. But I think of AI more as a broader thing, which is, it includes mathematical programming, it includes heuristics, it really includes, any intelligence that isn't derived from a human, and that really empowers decision making. So it's how do you take those complex problems and you break them down into chunks that computers can solve for people and recommend decisions. So I think, we have, optimization is really just in today's context, it's AI. So it's really about taking that really complex stuff and putting it in the hands of the everyday user and taking it out of that analyst or sort of strategic thinker and sort of giving it to the everyday user and empowering those business decisions. So it's, based on my past performance, what can I expect tomorrow or next week or next month? Based on market trends, how can I use that data to make better decisions? And it really becomes more, it isn't sort of large language model, but it's sort of large data model and using sort of numerical data and sort of empowering users and really kind of lowering the bar in terms of how we can empower users to use that kind of technology in their everyday work. So, whether it's a routing problem between 3 job sites that I have to go to today, or how my whole fleet is going to operate in terms of minimizing the loaded mile or maximizing the loaded miles that I'm hauling. So it's really about kind of, to me, it's really about bringing that technology bar down and lower, 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 so that it can really solve less complex problems, but things that sort of incrementally add value and sort of in volume really drive significant value. So lots
Yeah,
of better
so
little
yeah.
decisions add up to big value. So
Yeah, so thinking along the lines, if I keep you on this AI thread and love what you're saying, can you maybe give 3 examples? One example of kind of like a low hanging fruit AI use case that like we should be able to do this like with a little bit of a lift, and then one that I'm thinking about it today because it's obvious and given your role in Remsoft as director of product force operations, working on it and it's a little bit more of a lift. And then a third one that's kind of like this is crazy bleep that if these pieces of the puzzle fit together, we can unlock this thing that historically we haven't been able to. Can you walk me through those three examples and maybe our listeners will then be able to connect the dots in your words in terms of their world and go like, oh, okay. Walk me through that.
I think, forest operations has always been kind of a sweet spot for me. It's always been the place that I've been most interested in. And when you think about, in the shortest term, we have a solution today called Remsoft Operations that sort of helps people, schedule their harvesting areas using their crews, meet their mill demand in complex source sink relationships. It's really an ideal place to implement an optimization solution. We can kind of do it today, but it should be kind of like the big red easy button that you can just sort of mash. And it's like, here, solve my plan for the next month and give me the ability to kind of, optimize that solution. And, I remember when I was trying to implement optimization in a previous life that people are always, oh, well, it doesn't have any grounding in reality. And it's like, fine, but it does give you a sort of a mathematical vision to what good can look like, and then you sort of apply realistic from there. So it doesn't necessarily need to be positioned as this is perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And then it's up to you with your knowledge and experience to kind of make it real. So I think that's the obvious one of the most obvious problems to me is kind of automating that scheduling and sort of being able to be more responsive to changes to market demand, changes to fleet availability, changes to operating conditions like rain events or hurricanes or forest fires, being able to be more nimble on the land base and meet your customer demands at the lowest possible cost to maximize your margin. So that's kind of the sort of the nearest term one. I think the longer or the sort of the medium term one would be logistics. And I'm kind of focused on harvesting because something like 70% of the spend in the supply chain is tied to sort of once you decide you're going to harvest something to when you get it to the mill. That's a huge cost and a huge opportunity for the market. And it really comes down to that sort of transportation problem. It's like I have a bunch of sources and sinks. The wood's been produced. How do I maximize the efficiency of my harvesting or my transportation fleet to sort of get all the riders to their destination in terms of a dispatch model? So I think that there's been attempts to do this in the past, but I think maybe the market wasn't ready or people weren't ready. So I think it's a kind of a two-pronged problem: is how do you solve the realities of the business in terms of reflecting what the contractor needs out of it and reflecting what the buyer needs out of it. And I think that's probably how you win that day. I think the longest term vision that I would have would be kind of the harvester operator sitting in his couch running the harvester remotely with an AR, headset on. That you can do this now with simulators, so it's really just a matter of hooking up the telematics, having all the LiDAR data, 3D scanners on the machines, and basically having them so that they can be run. The operator doesn't have to drive an hour each direction on snowy roads in the middle of the winter at night to get into a machine and then be out there all alone in a remote area. And when this machine could effectively just be, with the appropriate terrestrial sensors, and sort of scanning the trees could be basically turned into an autonomous machine. So, or even a truck. I mean, that one's pretty easy one from not easy, but that's not that big of a stretch. You see it now with different electric cars, but I think the harvesting situation, you think of all the variables that person is having to run through. The cognitive load of running a harvester in the woods or even a feller buncher is huge because of all the things that are going on at one time. And I think making that less complex for the user to achieve and then essentially taking them right out of the equation would be where I'd like to see it go
Interesting.
at some point in the future. So
Interesting. And I know when you describe, the solo drive and the solo time in the bush, there's probably some Forester listeners going like, no, that's the best part of the job. I don't have to talk to anybody. I'm in the outdoors. No, Jason Dain, don't take that away from me. So just voicing that possible objection there. So
yep.
if I take you further into the future, 10, 20, maybe 30 years out, what does forestry look like, or how do you think it looks like? And what are those technologies that when you have a free time, you're thinking about way out there that you're like, I have no idea how this is going to shake out, but here's a couple scenarios. How do you describe that future state in terms of what the world looks like and the business of forestry and technology?
I think, I think the business of forestry, will come to recognize that sort of the triad of social, economic, and environmental a little bit better, and maybe have kind of more focus put on to the land that's best suited for forestry, the land that's best suited for recreation or other uses, and then the land that's just conserved. So I think, from a forestry practices perspective, I think that, recognizing that sort of the triad, the sort of the ecological forestry, um, will be realized. And I think from a technology side, then maximizing the use of resources on that space, growing the best trees for the market, using the highest or the best available technology to harvest them in the least environmentally damaging way, with biofuels or some other thing. There's all kinds of opportunities to improve the way, reduce the footprint on the landscape while still achieving the business of forestry. So I think, from an environmental side and from a technology side, I think both of those things need to sort of pull together to align and make the footprint of the business of forestry less. While still feeding the need that consumers have for forest products, because that's not going away.
Yeah.
Anytime soon.
Yeah. How do you think about climate? Is that something you think the forest industry is doing enough thinking about? And again, I always tell folks I'm not really that concerned about your climate beliefs as opposed to if more extreme weather events, if temperatures are changing, surely that impacts maybe the genetics you might use in a particular geography. What are your thoughts on climate? Is it something that we're really thinking about right now, or do you think people are not and we should, or um, the forest industry is resilient and forestry in general will handle it as it goes? How do you think about climate in general?
I think it's fairly reactive at this point. I think, we've had the hottest, driest summer since I've lived in the Maritimes in 25 years, in terms of, we didn't have rain for almost 3 months. And we had a couple of, significant forest fires, which is basically unheard of in this part of the country. So, I think people are, at least people here, are starting to realize, the number of hurricanes, the number of weather events, those are all things that are realistic and really will change the way we practice forestry. I think both in terms of site selection, in terms of, wind events. I see a lot of commercial thinning going on here, and we get hurricanes, we get wind events, and these things all end up on the ground. So you really got to ask yourself, yes, from the public perception, thinning seems great, but when all those trees are on the ground in 2 years, well, you've spent all that money to improve that site, but then, it's on the wrong side of a hill. It's on the coast facing, the hurricane alley for us, and it's just like maybe that wasn't the right choice. It maybe sounded good from an environmental perspective, but in reality, that's not the best treatment for that land. So I think, given the more sort of, catastrophic nature of weather and the changing climate, we need to be more adaptive in terms of our practices and changing. So, operating at different times of the day to prevent the risk of fires, doing different kinds of silviculture treatments to adapt to, more drought proof types of trees, more biodiversity in the forest to be more resilient against fires. A lot of these sort of tenets that we're going to turn this whole area into spruce plantation. Well, there's pests, there's fire, there's wind throw, there's all kinds of things that can happen to that sort of even age single species stand, that if you thought about things from a more catastrophic nature, it's like, well, how do we adapt to that in terms of our practices? So I think that's how we need to adapt and sort of be thinking along those lines in terms of being more preventative instead of reactive. Uh,
Right, right. And next question, I just have a few more. Not that you're retiring anytime soon, I know that, but before you retire, is there a problem? I shouldn't say problem, not a negative, a puzzle. Puzzle might be the better word. Is there a puzzle in forestry that you're like, come hell or high water, I am solving this thing before I hang my, I don't know, whatever shoes up or whatever the saying is there. Is there a forestry problem? You're like, I know I can solve this. I know I've got the right people, the technology, the company, the resource to do that. Is there one thing you're just like, I'm gonna crush this before that retirement date goes? Is there something like that? And if so, what is it?
yeah, it's funny because I've been at this business for a long, about 25 years plus, and there's a problem that was put to me as as an employee way back then that I still haven't been able to solve. And it was, basically reconciling kind of growth and yield, forester's estimate, harvester cutout, and sort of that land base, and kind of being able to say, how is my growth and yield matching up against what my forester said versus what's cutting out, and how do I sort of feed that loop back in to make better planning decisions so that the next time around I don't make the same mistakes or I learn from that learning. And I think that sort of feedback loop that we all talk about, I don't think I've realized that vision yet. And that when I was an on the ground forester, the stress always came at the end of the year when your blocks weren't cutting out at the percentage that you thought that they were. The product mix was different than you thought it was. And it's like, man, we got to do better. Like we have all the information. It's disconnected, it's disjointed, it doesn't line up, but all the information we need to learn from our mistakes and have that good feedback isn't getting back. So where it is just like constantly repeating the same thing. We're running out of blocks at the end of the year. We're not filling the quotas that we need to deliver. And it's that sort of that feedback loop. And maybe it's AI, maybe it's optimization, but it's really that, okay, I made this decision based on the fact that I did this two or three other times and got hit in the face. And now I'm not going to get hit in the face the next time. It's like getting out of the way when the train comes instead of getting hit by it every time. And that's the problem that I want to solve because we have everything at our disposal to do it. It's just a matter of getting it into a sort of a seamless, interconnected, a platform that gives them the ability to say, I'm about this to make this decision. Is this the right choice?
Right.
Or, should I be doing this or should I be doing something different? And that's what I'd like to see, before I hang up the boots, so to speak. Um, and I think we're almost there. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together and sort of being able to better learn from our mistakes.
Nice, nice, love it. And so as we look to wind down, the very last question I have, and the reason I ask it is because I know in this space that it's harder and harder to get young people to join this profession of being a forester, even though it's an amazing profession, career, opens up so many opportunities. And as we all know, foresters are not always the best storytellers or the ones that beat our chests in terms of the great work we're collectively doing. But I guess my question is, if you look back to young Jason Dain about to hop in that car and do the big drive away from mom and dad over to Thunder Bay, is there a piece of advice you would give young Jason that our listeners today would benefit as they think about potentially a career in forestry? What is that piece of advice you'd give them?
That's interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I've learned as I've matured in my career, and I think it would be to listen more. I think, young Jason probably sort of thought he knew more than he really did. I think old Jason still thinks that too, but to a certain extent. But, but I think that listen more, talk less would be the lesson that I would give to myself at an earlier age. And I don't think it was that detrimental, but I can think back to times where it's like, yeah, if I would have just stopped and slowed down and listened to my mom, her voice ringing in my ear, slow down, Jason, stop and listen, think, you know, make a rash decisions. Like this is a good lesson that I've kind of learned over the years, and I've slowed down and I've kind of stopped and think about things a lot more than I used to. But yeah, that would be the advice that I'd give to myself
Love it,
at
love it.
23 or whatever when I hit the ground running.
Yeah,
Um,
love it, love it. Well, on that note, great pearl wisdom there to share with some of the younger folks there. It's like listen more, but I'd also say, keep going. There's no right or wrong. Get those experiences and go explore the world and learn from that. So for folks that are listening to this podcast, and I'm suspecting there'll probably be many since you have a pretty large network in terms of friends and colleagues. What's the best way for someone to reach you if they want to get in touch, catch up? Have a virtual fika, pick your brain on different topics. What's the best way for folks to reach you?
Sure. Well, I'm on LinkedIn with my name, and I'm at Remsoft, so it's jason.dain at remsoft.com. I'm also on various forms of social media for my non-work stuff like photography. So I'll have public profiles on all those with my regular name. So you can reach me on any of those channels. So,
Yeah, I always like when you talk nonchalant of like those other activities. So for our listeners, this guy's like a rock star in the birding community as an example. So like people bow down to the stuff Jason Dane does. So that's a whole separate
uh,
podcast we can chat about. But hey, I really enjoy you taking the time to chat with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the office, in the Fredericton office in the not so distant future. So there you go,
yep,
folks.
same.
Jason Dane, Director of Product of Forest Operations at Remsoft. If you want to get a hold of him, feel free to reach him at jason.dain, Dain, at remsoft.com. Well, thanks very much, Jason, for your time, and we'll chat soon.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin.
Awesome. Cool. Bye for now.